Good evening, dear listener. Come, settle in. Imagine the soft glow of a lamp, the gentle weight of a shawl across your shoulders, and perhaps a warm cup of tea cradled in your hands. Chamomile, maybe, or a fragrant Earl Grey. Let the day slip away. Tonight we have a calm little mystery from St. Mary Mead, one that asks to be heard slowly, like a lullaby of logic and human kindness. If these gentle tales bring you comfort and rest, do consider subscribing for more soothing mysteries to ease you towards sleep. Now, breathe deeply, close your eyes if you like, and let us begin. In the hush of a late summer evening in St. Mary Mead, when the last light lingers over the churchyard yews and the air holds the faint sweetness of roses, a single sound carried across the gardens, a woman's scream, sharp and unmistakable. Oh, yet no one rushed to a door. No neighbor called out an alarm. The scream came, and then silence returned, as though nothing at all had happened. And in that ordinary quiet, Miss Jane Marple sat knitting by her window and wondered. Chapter 1. The Quiet Beginning. St. Mary Mead. In late August was a place that seemed to hold its breath. The heat of high summer had softened into something kinder. Days were still warm enough for linen dresses and open windows, but evenings brought a cool edge that made one grateful for a light cardigan. The village settled early. Shop blinds came down at 5:30. Lamps were lit by 6, and by 9 o'clock, most houses showed only a single glow from a bedroom or sitting room window. The church clock struck the hours with the same unhurried dignity it had kept for 150 years, and the sound floated over rooftops and garden walls, like a gentle reminder that time moved, but not quickly. Miss Jane Marple sat in the small front room of Mead Cottage. The French windows stood open to the garden, letting in the scent of late blooming sweet peas and the faint, earthy smell of turned soil from Mr. Phipps's rose beds 3 doors away. She was knitting a soft shawl in lavender wool, the kind of garment useful for cool autumn mornings or for draping over elderly shoulders at evening bridge parties. The needles clicked steadily, a small rhythmic sound that matched the pulse of the village itself. She was thinking, as she so often did at this hour, of the day just past. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and yet everything had felt quietly significant in the way only small village days can. Miss and Eleanor Prescott of Willowmere House had died in the night. The news had reached Miss Marple just after breakfast, brought by young Clara from the post office, who had stopped on her bicycle to deliver a parcel, and the tidings at the same time. Peacefully, they say, Clara had reported, cheeks flushed from cycling uphill. Mrs. Finch found her this morning when she let herself in, still in bed, looking calm as anything. Dr. Haydock came straight away and said it was her heart. Nothing unexpected at 92. Miss Marple had nodded, thanked Clara for the parcel, a new skein of the same lavender wool, and offered the usual small comforts. A cup of tea refused, a promise to call on Mrs. Finch later. After Clara had gone, Miss Marple had stood for a moment at the garden gate, looking down the lane toward Willowmere. The house stood at the far end, partly hidden by a high beech hedge, its white-painted shutters closed against the morning sun. It had always been a house of order. Eleanor Prescott had liked things just so. They had been acquainted since the year the Great War ended. 2 young women then, both unmarried, both quietly determined to make useful lives in a village that expected little of unmarried women beyond good works and good manners. Eleanor had been the more reserved of the two. She rarely laughed aloud, never gossiped, though she listened attentively and kept her own counsel on most matters. Her house reflected her: polished floors, neatly arranged books, every cushion plumped, every curtain hung with precision. She rose at the same hour each day, took tea at 7:30 precisely, walked to the post office at 10, then answered letters by return of post, and retired at 9:30 with a cup of cocoa and a chapter of Trollope or Austen. Miss Marple had visited her only 10 days earlier. They had sat in the drawing room at Willowmere, sunlight falling through lace curtains onto a tea tray set with thin china and a plate of shortbread. Eleanor had spoken of the garden mostly. The roses needed pruning, the delphiniums had not done well this year. But toward the end of the visit, she had grown thoughtful. "I have been thinking lately of old things," she had said, her voice low. "Things one ought to have said long ago. One puts them off, Jane, and then suddenly one realizes there may not be much time left." Miss Marple had answered gently that there was always time for the important things, and Eleanor had given one of her rare, small smiles. Perhaps, but some things are harder to say than others. They had parted on that note, Eleanor promising to send a cutting of her best lavender rose, Miss Marple promising to return the call soon. Neither promise had been kept. The cutting had not arrived, and the call had come too late. Now, sitting with her knitting, Miss Marple let her thoughts drift back over that conversation. There had been nothing alarming in Eleanor's manner, only a quiet gravity, the sort that comes to most people in their 90s. Yet something had lingered in Miss Marple's mind ever since. The way Eleanor's hands had rested on the arms of her chair, fingers lightly clasped, as though holding something invisible and precious. The church clock struck 9. Miss Marple glanced at the mantelpiece clock to confirm it, then returned to her stitches. Outside, the village was making its evening sounds. A gate clicking shut, footsteps on gravel, the low murmur of voices as Mr. and Mrs. Dane strolled home from evensong. Somewhere, a cat yowled once, then fell silent. A bat fluttered past the open window, dark against the fading sky, and then, quite suddenly, the scream. It came from the direction of Willowmere, clear and startling. A woman's voice, raised in a single, sharp cry. Not long, not repeated. Just one high, piercing note that cut through the evening hush and then vanished, leaving the air empty again. Miss Marple's needles paused. She tilted her head, listening. No second cry followed. No running feet, no doors opening, no voices calling out an alarm. After perhaps 10 seconds, the ordinary sounds resumed. A blackbird in the yew tree, the faint clink of china from the vicarage kitchen, and the slow tread of old Mr. Phipps locking his greenhouse for the night. She waited another minute, then resumed knitting. But the rhythm of her stitches was slower now, more deliberate. A scream, she thought, is not the sort of thing one mistakes. A fox can sound uncanny, an owl alarming, a cat in season positively blood-curdling. But this had been unmistakably human. A woman's voice, brief but unmistakable. And yet no one had reacted. Not the Danes, whose windows overlooked the lane. Not Clara, who lived above the post office and kept her window open on warm nights. Not even Mr. Phipps, whose hearing, though old, was still sharp enough to catch the squeak of a gate hinge 50 yards away. Miss Marple smiled a little to herself, a small private smile. People, she had long ago observed, were very good at explaining away the things they did not wish to investigate. A scream in the evening could be a dozen harmless things. Someone shutting a sash window too sharply. A child having a nightmare. A practical joke. a moment's hysteria over a spider. In a village like St. Mary Mead, where life moved in well-worn grooves, people preferred explanations that kept those grooves undisturbed. Still, Eleanor Prescott had died that very night, or rather, in the early hours of the following morning, peacefully, in her sleep, according to Dr. Haydock. A natural end. No need for inquest. No cause for concern. Miss Marple turned another row. The lavender wool slid smoothly through her fingers. She thought of Eleanor's neat handwriting, her carefully kept house, her quiet determination that everything should be just so, even, perhaps, on the manner of her going. A scream no one had investigated, a death no one had questioned. An old woman who had once said she had things she ought to have said long ago. Miss Marple reached the end of the row, counted her stitches, and began the next. The evening deepened. The lamp beside her cast a warm circle of light over the knitting. The tea tray, the open windows, the peaceful room. And somewhere in the back of her mind, quite calmly, a small question took root. Why would a woman who never raised her voice in life cry out so sharply on the very night she left it? Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. The morning after the scream dawned bright and ordinary. The kind of August morning that makes one forget any small disturbance of the previous evening. Sunlight slanted through the lime trees along the green, that turning the dew on the grass into tiny points of silver. Birds sang with the careless enthusiasm of creatures who have no calendars and no funerals to attend. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, made her bed with the same neat precision she had used for 60 years, prepared a light breakfast of tea and toast, and then set out along the lane toward Willowmere House. She walked slowly, partly because slow walking suited her age, and partly because it gave her time to notice things. The hedgerows were still heavy with blackberries, late ones dark and sweet. A few late roses clung to the wall of the old rectory. Mr. Phipps was already out with his secateurs, snipping spent blooms from his prize peace roses. He raised his hat as she passed and remarked that it was a beautiful morning for it, whatever it might be. And Miss Marple agreed that it was indeed. Willowmere House looked much as it always had. Georgian symmetry, white painted window frames, a gravel drive raked smooth even now. The beech hedge had been clipped the week before, not a leaf out of place. Only the drawn curtains at the upper windows hinted that something final had occurred within. Mrs. Finch, Eleanor's daily help for the past 15 years, opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. Her eyes were pink-rimmed, but her apron was spotless, her hair neatly pinned. Grief in St. Mary Mead did not excuse untidiness. Miss Marple, how kind of you to come so soon, she said, stepping back to let her enter. I was just sorting through a few things. Would you like tea? The kettle's on. Thank you, Mrs. Finch, but perhaps later. I wanted only to offer my sympathy and to see if there was anything I could do. Mrs. Finch led the way into the hall. The house smelled faintly of lavender polish and the sweet, almost medicinal scent of old roses brought in from the garden the day before. Everything was as Eleanor would have wished. The grandfather clock in the corner ticking steadily. The brass umbrella stand empty. Eleanor had never liked clutter. The small table by the door holding a silver tray with yesterday's post still unopened. On that same table lay Eleanor's spectacles, foldable half-moons in a thin gold frame, placed exactly parallel to the edge. Beside them, a single sheet of pale blue notepaper, the top half covered in handwriting Miss Marple recognized at once. Mrs. Finch noticed her glance. She was writing to her niece in Canada. Miss Margaret, you in Toronto. Every Monday without fail, regular as the post. This one, well, she never finished it. May I? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Finch hesitated only a moment, then nodded. I don't see why not. Nothing private in it, as far as I can tell. She hadn't got far. Miss Marple lifted the sheet carefully, as though it might crumble. The letter began in Eleanor's familiar copper plate, small and upright. My dear Margaret, thank you for your last note, which reached me on the 28th. How quickly the post travels these days. The garden has been kind this summer. The new hybrid teas are doing splendidly, though the delphiniums suffered from the wet June. I enclose a small pressed bloom for your album. I have been thinking a good deal lately of family matters. One reaches an age when the past seems nearer than the future, and certain things one has carried in silence begin to weigh more heavily. I have decided I must speak plainly. There is something I have kept silent for too long. It concerns your grandfather's will, and the share that the sentence broke off there. No crossing out, no hesitation in the flow up to that point. Simply an end, as though the pen had been laid down in the middle of a thought, or as though the writer had been interrupted by something sudden and unexpected. Miss Marple read it twice, then refolded the paper with the same care she would have given a valuable letter. She was quite well on Monday afternoon, Mrs. Finch volunteered. I left at 4, as usual. She said she would finish her letter after supper and post it herself in the morning. She liked to walk to the pillar box, said the fresh air did her good. And in the evening, Miss Marple asked, did you happen to speak to anyone who saw her after you left? Mrs. Finch shook her head. Not that I know of. She always drew her own curtains and locked up. Very independent, was Mrs. Prescott. But I did hear from Mrs. Dane later, about the scream. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, several people mentioned it. It gave me quite a turn when I heard, Mrs. Finch said. I was already home, washing up, but my kitchen window faces this way. Sharp it was, like someone taken sudden fright. I even looked out, but the lane was empty. Then nothing more. I thought perhaps a vixen, though it didn't sound quite like one. Or someone in the house, Miss Marple suggested quietly. Mrs. Finch looked startled. But Mrs. Prescott was already in bed by then. She always retired by 8:30 in summer, said the evenings drew in so early, and she never called out. Not once in all the years I worked for her. If she needed me after hours, she would telephone, but she disliked bothering people. Miss Marple glanced towards the staircase. The carpet was thick, the treads polished but not slippery. A fall would have made noise, thumps, perhaps a cry, but not a single clear scream floating out over closed windows and across gardens. Her bedroom window was closed when you found her? She asked. Oh, yes. All the windows were closed except the little one in the attic landing. She always left that open a crack for air, summer and winter. But the attic door was shut, so no draught. Miss Marple stored the detail away. One small window open high up, all others closed. A scream that had carried clearly to 6 houses, yet come from a woman who disliked noise and kept her house sealed against it. Mrs. Finch wiped her hands on her apron. Would you like to see the room? It's just as she left it. I haven't touched anything except to draw the sheet up properly. Miss Marple followed her up the stairs. The bedroom was small, feminine, orderly. A mahogany bedstead with a white counterpane, a dressing table, with silver-backed brushes, a small armchair by the window. On the night table stood an empty cocoa cup, rinsed and inverted on its saucer, a Bible open at the Psalms, and a pair of reading glasses folded beside it. The bed had been made up fresh that morning, Mrs. Finch's doing no doubt, but the impression remained of someone who had simply lain down and not risen again. She looked peaceful. Mrs. Finch said softly. A little smile, almost, hands folded. I thought at first she was just sleeping late. Miss Marple stood a moment in silence, taking in the room. No sign of struggle, no disarranged bedclothes, no fallen book or spilled cup. Only the quiet that follows a gentle departure. As they descended the stairs again, Miss Marple asked one more question. The gramophone in the attic, does it still work? Mrs. Finch looked surprised. The old one, with the horn? Yes, I believe so. She hadn't used it in years, but young Tommy from the garage came round a fortnight ago to oil it and fit a new needle. Said she'd asked for it specially. A keepsake, she told him, an old record of her sister's voice singing. Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out into the sunshine. The lane was quiet now. A butterfly drifted past, and somewhere a lawnmower started up, then stopped again. Ordinary sounds, ordinary morning. But in Miss Marple's mind, two small things had begun to sit side by side. An unfinished letter that ended on the words, "It concerns," and a scream that had come from a house where all the downstairs windows were closed, yet had been heard quite distinctly by people half a street away. She walked home slowly, the scent of late roses following her. Chapter 3. Gentle Observations. The days following Eleanor Prescott's passing slipped by with the gentle inevitability of late summer turning toward autumn. The mornings remained bright, but a faint crispness had begun to creep into the air by evening, reminding everyone that the long, easy days would not last forever. In St. Mary Mead, our life continued in its accustomed rhythm. The butcher's boy cycled past with his basket of parcels, the milkman left bottles on doorsteps before dawn, and the church bells rang for matins and evensong with the same measured cadence they had kept since Victoria's reign. Miss Marple did not hurry. Hurry, she had long ago decided, was the enemy of clear thought. She continued her small daily routines, deadheading the last of the roses in her own garden, watering the pots of geraniums on the front step, knitting a few more rows of the lavender shawl each evening by lamplight. But beneath these ordinary acts, her mind moved quietly, gathering impressions the way one gathers fallen petals after a breeze. She began quite naturally with the people who had heard the scream most clearly. First, the vicarage. Mrs. Dane, the vicar's wife, was a sensible woman in her late 50s, with a kind face and a habit of noticing small domestic details others overlooked. Miss Marple called on Tuesday afternoon, bringing a small pot of her own lemon curd as an excuse. They sat in the vicarage drawing room, windows open to the garden, where the late delphiniums still stood tall. I heard it quite distinctly, Mrs. Dane said, pouring tea with a steady hand. Just after sunset, perhaps 9:15. A woman's voice, sharp and startled. It made me pause in the middle of turning down the beds upstairs. I even went to the landing window and looked out, but the lane was quite empty. No lights went on at Willowmere, no door opened. After a moment, I thought perhaps I'd imagined it, or that it was one of the village girls playing some silly game, but it didn't sound playful. Miss Marple accepted her cup. The direction. Definitely from the Willowmere side. Sound carries so strangely across the gardens in the evening. Sometimes things from the far end of the green sound as though they're next door. But this was clear, not muffled, not distant, and nothing after. Nothing at all. No second cry, no footsteps, just the usual evening sounds. The blackbird settling, Mr. Phipps shutting his greenhouse door. I told the vicar when he came in from his study, but he only said it was probably a fox. Men, she added, with a small, fond smile, will always find the most convenient explanation. Miss Marple smiled in return. And you? I wasn't so sure. But when we heard the next morning that poor Mrs. Prescott had passed in the night, well, one doesn't like to dwell on such things. It seemed kinder to let it be a fox after all. From the vicarage, Miss Marple walked on to the post office. Young Clara was behind the counter, sorting the afternoon post into pigeonholes. At 19, she still had the quick movements and bright eyes of youth, though village life had already taught her a certain quiet discretion. Yes, I heard it too, Clara said, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I was just locking up. Must have been 10 to 9. It came over the rooftops, really sharp. Made me jump, I can tell you. I stood there on the step listening, half expecting someone to come running round the corner. But nothing, not a soul. The street was empty except for old Mrs. Carter's cat, sitting on the wall, looking smug, as if he'd caused it himself. Miss Marple purchased a book of stamps she did not immediately need. You live above the shop, don't you? Your window faces this way? Yes, Miss Marple. I even opened it after I'd gone up, just to listen. But there was only the wind in the trees and the clock striking 9. I told Mum about it. She said I was imagining things. But I wasn't. It was real. Miss Marple thanked her and continued along the lane. She passed the small row of almshouses where old Mr. Phipps lived in the end cottage. He was in his front garden, tying up dahlias with soft twine. At 87, his back was bent, but his hearing remained remarkably acute. Ah, Miss Marple, he called, straightening as best he could. Come to see if the roses are still alive? They're hanging on just. She admired the blooms, deep crimson, petals perfect, and after a moment asked if he had been in his garden on Monday evening. Most certainly. I always take a last look round before locking up. About 8:45 it would have been. And yes, I heard it. Gave me quite a start. Thought someone had trodden on the cat. But it came from over yonder. He gestured with his secateurs toward Willowmere. And then nothing more. I waited a bit, listening, but all was quiet. So I finished with the ties and went in. Next morning, when I heard the news, well, I suppose it might have been her. Though she wasn't one for crying out, was she? No, Miss Marple agreed softly. She was not. Mr. Phipps lowered his voice. Mind you, young Harold Prescott arrived yesterday from London. Looks worn, poor man. Not surprised, losing his aunt like that, though he didn't come much these last years. Busy with his work, I dare say. Miss Marple nodded. Harold Prescott, Eleanor's only nephew. He had indeed arrived on the Tuesday morning train. A tall, quiet man of about 58, with thinning grey hair and the slightly stooped shoulders of someone who spent too many hours at a desk. He had been seen walking in the garden at Willowmere, hands in pockets, looking at the roses his aunt had tended so carefully. When the vicar spoke to him outside the church, Harold's replies had been polite but brief. No tears, no outburst. Just a calm, almost relieved air, as though a long-expected event had at last occurred. Miss Marple observed him once more on Wednesday morning. He was standing by the lych gate of the churchyard while the gravedigger prepared the plot. He did not weep. He simply stood, hat in hand, watching the work with an expression that was difficult to read. Sorrow, certainly, but also something else. Perhaps the lifting of a weight, or the quiet satisfaction of duties about to be completed. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her own garden with a cup of tea, watching the light change on the leaves. She thought of the people she had spoken to, sensible Mrs. Dane, who had looked out but seen nothing, young Clara, who had jumped but found the street empty, old Mr. Phipps, who had listened and then gone indoors, Harold Prescott, who had come from London, and now stood ready to arrange what remained. And through all these small conversations ran the same thread. A scream heard by several, investigated by none, and then, almost at once, dismissed. A scream from a house where a woman lay dying quietly in her bed. A scream that had floated out clearly on a still evening, yet come from behind closed windows and drawn curtains. Miss Marple set her cup down carefully on the wicker table. The lavender shawl lay across her lap, half finished, the wool soft against her fingers. She picked up the needles again and began another row, each stitch placed with deliberate calm. The pieces were small, she thought, scattered, but they were beginning to lie in a pattern, one that had less to do with sudden fright or accident, and more to do with intention. Quiet, careful intention. The church clock struck 4. Somewhere a blackbird sang. The afternoon drifted on, peaceful and unhurried. Chapter 4. A calm. Contradiction. By Wednesday afternoon, the village had settled into the gentle rhythm that follows a quiet death. The shock of Eleanor Prescott's passing had softened into a mild communal melancholy. People spoke of her in the past tense with the same calm respect they might have used for a well-kept garden that had finally come to season's end. Flowers began to appear at the lych gate. Small bunches of late roses, sprays of Michaelmas daisies tied with garden twine. The funeral was arranged for Thursday at 11, and already the undertaker's men had been seen carrying the plain oak coffin into the church vestry. Miss Marple invited Dr. Haydock to tea in her garden. He arrived punctually at 3:30, hat in hand, his old-fashioned tweed jacket smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and carbolic soap. They sat beneath the copper beech, where the light filtered through leaves already tinged with the first hints of bronze. A low table held a tray, thin bread and butter, seed cake, and a pot of tea kept hot under a knitted cozy Miss Marple had made herself years before. Dr. Haydock accepted his cup with a small nod of thanks. "You look well, Jane," he said, "though I dare say you've been thinking." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "One does at my age, especially when small things refuse to lie down neatly." He stirred his tea slowly. "You're thinking of Monday evening, I suppose, the scream." "Among other things," she agreed. Everyone heard it. Mrs. Dane, Clara, Mr. Phipps, clear as a bell, they all said. A woman's cry, sharp and unmistakable. Yet no one went to see. And the next morning, Mrs. Prescott was found dead in her bed. Peacefully, you told us. Dr. Haydock set his spoon down. Heart failure. She'd had a murmur for years. Nothing dramatic. But at 92, the heart doesn't need much excuse to stop. No pain, no struggle. She simply slipped away in her sleep. I saw no reason to doubt it then, and I see none now. Miss Marple looked across the garden to where a late butterfly rested on a buddleia. Yet the scream, she said gently, if it came from her, if it was a cry of sudden pain or fright, would it have carried so clearly? The doctor raised an eyebrow. Sound does strange things in the evening. Open windows, still air. But the windows were closed, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Finch confirmed it. All the downstairs windows shut tight, as Mrs. Prescott always kept them after dusk. She disliked drafts, disliked noise from outside. The only window open at all was the small one on the attic landing. A crack, no more. And even then, the attic door was closed when Mrs. Finch found her. Dr. Haydock frowned slightly. You're suggesting the scream couldn't have come from inside the house? I'm suggesting it would have been muffled, Miss Marple replied. A cry from a bedroom behind closed windows and thick walls on a still night would not float across gardens and lanes so distinctly that half a dozen people noticed it at once. Foxes and owls manage it because they call out of doors. But a human voice, especially an elderly woman's, would be softened, absorbed by curtains and plaster and glass. He considered this in silence for a moment, sipping his tea. Then perhaps it wasn't her scream at all. Someone else in the village. A nightmare, a fall, a moment's hysteria. Perhaps, Miss Marple said, but no one has come forward. No one reported an accident or a fright. And the direction? Everyone agreed it came from the Willowmere side. Not from the green. Not from the almshouses. From her house. Dr. Haydock set his cup down carefully. You're building towards something, Jane? What is it? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. Only this. If the scream did not come from Eleanor Prescott in her bedroom, and yet everyone heard it coming from her direction, then either someone else was in the house and cried out, or something else made the sound. Something placed there deliberately. The doctor looked at her steadily. You mean a trick? A recording? Some childish prank? Not childish, she said quietly. Very deliberate. Eleanor was never one for jokes, but she was always one for order, for making sure things were understood exactly as she intended them to be. He leaned back in his chair. You think she arranged it herself? And that she made a recording of a scream and played it on Monday evening, knowing she might die in the night? Miss Marple did not answer at once. Instead, she reached for the teapot and refilled both cups with the calm, unhurried movements that had characterized her all her life. I think, she said at last, that we should consider why anyone would want a scream to be heard. Not a quiet passing in sleep, but a sharp public event. Something that would linger in people's memories. Something that would be mentioned again and again if questions were ever asked. Dr. Haydock stared at her. Questions about what? About whether her death was natural. Precisely, Miss Marple said. If someone later suggested, however idly, that perhaps it had not been quite so peaceful, that perhaps something had hastened it, and then the memory of a scream would be very useful. A sudden cry of distress fits neatly with a heart giving out in pain. It explains any small sign that might otherwise seem puzzling. A rumpled sheet, a look of faint surprise on the face. Even the unfinished letter on the hall table. He exhaled slowly. You've seen the letter. Mrs. Finch showed it to me. It ends abruptly. It concerns your grandfather's will, and the share that she was writing to her niece in Canada. She had decided, after many years, to speak of an old family wrong. Something about a legacy, a division of money that had caused bitterness long ago. She meant to set it right. Dr. Haydock rubbed his chin. Harold Prescott inherits most of what's left, the house, the small investments. He's the only close relative here, and the niece in Toronto gets a few keepsakes and whatever jewelry remains. Nothing to quarrel over. Perhaps not now, Miss Marple murmured. But 30 years ago, when Eleanor's brother died, Harold's father. There was a disagreement. Eleanor believed her brother had taken more than his share of their father's estate. She never spoke of it openly, but it troubled her. Lately, she had begun to feel the weight of that silence. The doctor looked troubled. You'd think she feared Harold would resent her for raising it at the end, that he might contest the will or spread whispers. I think she feared the village might whisper, Miss Marple said, that if she died quietly, and then the letter came to light, people might say she had been troubled in mind, unhappy, guilty, that her death had been convenient for someone. Doctor, Haydock was silent a long moment. And the scream, he said at last, would be proof she had suffered a sudden attack, a natural, traumatic end. Nothing suspicious. Miss Marple inclined her head. Exactly. The garden was very still. A leaf drifted down and settled on the tea tray. Somewhere beyond the hedge, a child laughed once, then ran indoors. Dr. Haydock finished his tea and set the cup aside. It's ingenious, he admitted, but it's also macabre. An old woman arranging her own death scene, down to the sound effect. Not macabre, Miss Marple corrected gently, orderly. Eleanor always liked things tidy, even her dying. He looked at her with something like admiration mixed with unease. And if you're right, then we have only to discover how she did it, Miss Marple said, and why she felt it necessary. The sun had begun to slant lower, turning the copper beach to flame. Miss Marple gathered the tea things onto the tray with the same calm care she gave everything. Another cup before you go? She asked. Dr. Haydock smiled faintly. I think not, Jane. I think I've had quite enough to think about for one afternoon. He rose, thanked her, and walked slowly down the path. Miss Marple watched him go, then returned to her chair. The lavender shawl lay across the arm. She picked it up and began another row, the needles moving steadily in the golden light. A small contradiction had appeared, a scream that should not have carried so far from a house of closed windows, a quiet death that had been announced quite deliberately by a loud public sound. The pattern was growing clearer, not yet complete, but clearer. Chapter 5. A Detail Revisited. Thursday morning arrived with a soft mist that hung low over the village, veiling the church spire and turning the lanes into quiet tunnels of grey and green. The funeral was still 2 hours away, but already a few early walkers moved along the paths with flowers in their arms. Miss Marple rose as usual, dressed in her best dark grey coat and a small felt hat trimmed with a single velvet ribbon, then walked the short distance to Willowmere House. Harold Prescott opened the door himself. He looked composed, though the skin beneath his eyes was faintly shadowed. The house behind him felt emptier now. Fewer footsteps on the stairs, fewer small sounds of daily life. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Please come in. I was just going through some papers." She stepped into the hall. On the silver tray still held the unfinished letter, though it had been moved slightly to one side, as though Harold had been reading it again. The spectacles remained beside it, folded with care. "I wondered," Miss Marple began gently, "if you would allow me one more look at your aunt's letter to Margaret. There is something in it I should like to consider again." Harold hesitated only a moment, then nodded. "Of course. I've read it myself several times since Mrs. Finch showed it to me. It troubles me a little." Miss Marple took the sheet carefully. The change in the handwriting was as striking as before. The first paragraphs flowed in Eleanor's neat, controlled copperplate. small letters, even spacing, every comma precise. Then, midway down the page, the pen strokes grew bolder, larger, almost urgent. I have decided I must speak plainly. There is something I have kept silent for too long. It concerns your grandfather's will, and the share that should rightly have gone to your father. I allowed the matter to be settled without protest at the time, believing silence kinder than dispute. But silence, I now see, has its own cost. I mean to set this right before. And there it ended. No final flourish, no signature. The ink of the last word had not even had time to dry completely before the pen was set aside. Miss Marple studied the break in the script. You said she wrote to you a fortnight ago? Harold nodded. Yes. A short note, quite unlike her usual style. She said she had been reflecting on old family matters and felt it was time to speak plainly. She asked if I remembered the details of grandfather's estate, the small legacy divided between her brother and herself. No, I wrote back that of course I remembered, and that I bore no grudge for anything that had happened before my time. I told her the past was the past, and her reply? There was none, or rather, none reached me. Perhaps she intended this letter to Margaret to explain everything fully, and then to send copies or summaries to the rest of us. Miss Marple refolded the paper. She was interrupted, do you think? Or did she stop of her own accord? Harold looked down at his hands. I don't know. She might have felt suddenly tired. Or perhaps something startled her. Miss Marple glanced toward the staircase. The scream came later that evening, after she would have finished supper and come upstairs to write. He followed her gaze. You think she was writing when it happened? That something frightened her into crying out? Perhaps, Miss Marple said softly. But the windows were closed, and the cry carried so clearly, too clearly for a bedroom on the first floor. Harold rubbed his forehead. I've been turning it over in my mind ever since Dr. Haydock confirmed there was no sign of disturbance. No forced entry, no sign anyone had been here but her. Yet that scream. It doesn't fit with a quiet heart giving out in sleep. Miss Marple moved to the small table by the door where the gramophone record catalogue still lay. An old one, its cover faded. She opened it idly, running her finger down the list of titles. You mentioned the gramophone in the attic, she said. Your aunt asked young Tommy to mend it a fortnight ago. Harold looked surprised. Did she? I hadn't heard that. She kept it up there for years. An old acoustic model with the big horn. It belonged to my grandmother. Aunt Eleanor used to play records of my mother singing when I was small. Lullabies, mostly. She said it comforted her. Miss Marple closed the catalogue. Tommy told me she specifically asked for a new needle and the mechanism oiled. He thought she wanted to hear an old family record again. Harold gave a small, sad smile. That sounds like her. She kept things, you know, letters, photographs, even the programs from concerts my mother sang in before she married. She never threw anything away that held her memory. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And yet, she rarely played the gramophone in recent years. The attic is dusty. The horn would need to be turned towards the small open window to carry sound outside. Harold stared at her. No, you think she used it to make the scream? Not to make one, in the ordinary sense, Miss Marple said, but perhaps to play one. A recording she had prepared herself. A single, short sound, a woman's cry, practiced until it was convincing. Set to play at a certain time, with the gramophone placed near that high attic window. The rest of the house closed up as usual. The sound would carry out and over the gardens, clear and startling, while she herself lay safely in bed below. Harold exhaled slowly. But why? Why go to such trouble? Miss Marple looked at him with quiet compassion. Because she wished her death to be remembered in a particular way, not as a silent slipping away that might invite whispers. Was she troubled? Was there something on her mind? Did someone help her along? But as a sudden, a natural event marked by a cry of distress, the scream would be the explanation for any small anomaly, and the unfinished letter would be found later after everything was settled, when it could do no harm except to set the record straight. Harold sat down slowly on the hall chair. She was going to confess the old wrong to Margaret and perhaps to me. She feared I might resent it, or that others might think her mind had failed at the end, that the confession had unbalanced her, or that it had made her death convenient, Miss Marple added gently, for someone who stood to inherit. He looked up sharply. Not me. I swear it. I had no idea how much she intended to leave me, and I would never have wished her gone sooner. Miss Marple placed a hand lightly on his arm. I know that, Harold. But your aunt was a woman who liked certainty. She arranged the scream as a kind of insurance. Proof, if ever needed, that her end had been sudden and natural, and she died peacefully, as we know she did. The mist outside the window had begun to lift. Pale sunlight touched the hall floor. Harold looked at the unfinished letter again. I'll post it to Margaret today, he said quietly. And I'll add my own note. Tell her Aunt Eleanor meant to make things right, that she succeeded, in her own way. Miss Marple smiled. That would be kind. She turned toward the door. I shall see you at the church. Everything will be as it should be. Harold stood. Thank you, Miss Marple, for listening, for seeing what no one else did. She paused on the threshold. Sometimes the smallest detail, revisited, shows us the whole picture. She stepped out into the clearing morning. The scream, once mysterious, was beginning to make a different kind of sense. Not a cry of fear, but a carefully placed note in the quiet music of a long, orderly life. Chapter 6. Quiet explanation. The mist of early morning had quite dissolved by 10 o'clock, leaving the village bathed in the soft, forgiving light that September sometimes borrows from August. The churchyard yews stood dark and still. The gravel paths had been raked smooth. Small groups of villagers in dark coats gathered near the lych gate, speaking in low voices. The funeral service would begin in less than an hour, but Miss Marple had asked for a few moments beforehand at Willowmere House. Harold Prescott received her in the drawing room. Mrs. Finch was there also, standing near the window with her hands folded over her apron, her face composed but watchful. The room smelled faintly of lilies, the ones that had arrived that morning from the garden club, and of the polish Mrs. Finch had applied the day before. Everything was in order, as Eleanor would have wished. Miss Marple settled into the armchair she had occupied so many times before, facing the two of them across the low tea table. No tea was offered. This was not a social call. She spoke quietly, without preamble, her voice carrying the same gentle authority it always had when the moment for explanation arrived. The scream everyone heard on Monday evening, she began, was not a cry of distress from Eleanor Prescott in her bedroom. It was a recording. Mrs. Finch drew in a small, sharp breath. Harold leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on Miss Marple's face. She had the old gramophone brought down from the attic 2 weeks earlier, Miss Marple continued. Young Tommy from the garage came to see to it. New needle, mechanism oiled, turntable checked. He assumed she wished to hear an old record of her sister singing something sentimental. But that was not the purpose. Eleanor had prepared something quite different. She paused, letting the words settle. A single sound, a woman's scream, brief, sharp, convincing. She must have practiced it herself, perhaps speaking into the recording horn on several attempts, until she achieved exactly the tone and duration she wanted. One clear note of alarm, nothing theatrical, nothing prolonged. Just enough to startle anyone within earshot and lodge in memory. She set the gramophone on the small table beneath the attic landing window, the one she always left open a crack, summer and winter, for ventilation. She positioned the horn so that it faced outward. Then she wound the mechanism fully, placed the record, and set the automatic start lever to engage at approximately 9:15. Harold spoke softly. And then she went downstairs, closed every other window and door as usual, drew the curtains, and retired to bed with her cocoa. Precisely, Miss Marple said. The house was sealed against drafts and noise, as it always was after dusk. The only opening was that small high window in the attic. The sound escaped there, clear, unimpeded, and carried across the still evening air to the vicarage, the post office, Mr. Phipps's garden, and several other houses. Because it came from above roof level, unobstructed by walls or hedges, it sounded nearer and more distinct than any cry from the first floor bedroom could have done. Mrs. Finch shook her head slowly. But why, Miss Marple? Why go to such lengths? Mrs. Prescott was never one for dramatics. Miss Marple looked at her with kindness. Not dramatics, Mrs. Finch. Certainty. Eleanor was a woman who disliked loose ends. For many years she had carried a small private burden, an old family injustice concerning her father's will. Her brother, your father Harold, received rather more than she believed was fair. She never contested it at the time. She thought silence the kinder course. But silence, left too long, can curdle into regret. In her 90s, with time growing short, she decided the matter must be spoken of plainly. She began the letter to Margaret, intending it as the first step toward putting things right. She meant, I believe, to send similar explanations to you, Harold, and perhaps to leave instructions with her solicitor. Harold nodded, almost imperceptibly. She wrote to me that she felt the past needed airing. I told her there was no need, no resentment on my part. But she was determined. She was, Miss Marple agreed. And she knew, because she knew human nature, that once the letter became public, as such things eventually do in a village, people would talk. They would say, poor Eleanor, troubled by old wrongs at the end of her life. They might whisper that guilt had weighed on her mind, that perhaps her heart had not simply failed, that perhaps worry, or even something worse, had hastened it. And then they would look at you, Harold, and the nephew who stood to inherit the house and the greater part of what remained. They would wonder, however idly, whether the timing had been convenient. Harold winced, but did not interrupt. Eleanor wished to forestall all of that. Miss Marple went on. She knew her heart was weak. Dr. Haydock had warned her gently more than once. She understood she might die quietly in her sleep, with no outward sign of distress. A peaceful passing is a blessing, but in this case, it would have left room for speculation. So she arranged a public event, a sharp, unmistakable scream to mark the moment of her going. If anyone later questioned the manner of her death, the village would remember. But there was that terrible cry everyone heard. She must have felt a sudden pain, a spasm of the heart. It was quick, but it was natural. The scream became her explanation, her protection, her last small act of tidiness. Mrs. Finch wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron. All that trouble, just so people wouldn't talk unkindly. Not unkindly, Miss Marple corrected gently. Carelessly. Eleanor disliked carelessness above all things. She wanted the story of her death to be simple and complete. No mysteries, no whispers, no shadows cast on those she left behind. Harold looked at the empty fireplace, and she succeeded. Until you began asking questions, no one thought twice about it. We all accepted the fox or the owl or the startled cat. Even after she was found, we said, "Poor lady, she must have cried out in her last moment." It never occurred to anyone that she had planned it. Miss Marple inclined her head. She planned it carefully, but not cruelly. There was no deception in the medical sense. Dr. Haydock's certificate is perfectly true. Heart failure, peaceful, no violence, no interference. Only a sound placed where it would be heard to shape the memory of that night. A clock chimed the half-hour in the hall. The funeral would begin soon. Mrs. Finch spoke again, her voice steadier now. She was always like that, you know. Everything in its place. The linen folded just so, the letters answered the same day. The garden weeded before the weeds could take hold. Even dying, she wanted that tidy too. Yes, Miss Marple said, and now it is tidy. Harold rose slowly. What should I do with the gramophone? With the record? Leave it in the attic for the present, Miss Marple suggested. One day, perhaps, when Margaret visits from Canada, you might show it to her. Tell her the story, not as a morbid curiosity, but as proof of how deeply your aunt cared for order, for fairness, for peace of mind in those she loved. I think Margaret would understand. Harold managed a small, sad smile. I'll post the letter this afternoon. I've written my own note to go with it. I'll tell her Aunt Eleanor meant to make amends, and in her own way, she did. Miss Marple stood. That is all anyone can ask. They moved toward the door together. Mrs. Finch opened it. The soft September air flowed in, carrying the scent of cut grass and distant wood smoke. At the threshold, Harold turned. Thank you, Miss Marple. Not just for seeing what happened, but for seeing why. It makes the whole thing gentler, somehow. Miss Marple touched his sleeve lightly. Human beings are seldom as simple as gossip makes them, or as wicked as suspicion paints them. Mostly, they are only trying to do the best they can with what they have left. She stepped out into the lane. Harold and Mrs. Finch followed a moment later, closing the door softly behind them. The three of them walked slowly toward the church, joining the small procession already forming. No one hurried. The bell began to toll, slow, measured, comforting. Inside the cool dimness of the church, the coffin waited beneath a pall of white flowers. The vicar's voice rose gently in the opening sentences. Harold stood in the front pew, head bowed. Mrs. Finch sat a little behind, hands clasped. Miss Marple took her usual place near the aisle, where she could see both the altar and the faces of those gathered. No one mentioned the scream during the service. It was no longer necessary. So the mystery had folded itself away, quiet as a letter slipped into an envelope, sealed and posted. What remained was order restored, a small wrong acknowledged at last, and the simple decency of an old woman's careful heart. Afterward, As people drifted out into the sunshine, Miss Marple lingered a moment by the grave. The earth was dark and freshly turned. A single rose lay on the mound. She thought of Eleanor, not the dramatic final gesture, but the long years of quiet choices, small kindnesses, unvoiced regrets finally given voice. The scream no one had truly understood had, in the end, said everything that needed saying. Chapter 7. Peaceful Resolution. The church bell ceased its slow tolling just as the last notes of the closing hymn drifted into the rafters. Sunlight, pale and benevolent, he slanted through the high stained glass windows, casting soft lozenges of color across the stone floor, ruby from the robe of St. John, sapphire from the Virgin's mantle, gold from the halo above the Christ child. The congregation rose in quiet unison. Pews creaked faintly. Hymn books were closed with gentle snaps, and the small procession began to move towards the west door. Harold Prescott walked first, alone, head uncovered. Behind him came Mrs. Finch, eyes downcast but steady. Then a scattering of villagers who had known Eleanor for decades. The vicar's wife, carrying a single white lily. Old Mr. Phipps leaning on his stick. Young Clara from the post office with a posy of Michaelmas daisies tied with ribbon. Miss Marple followed near the end, as she preferred, able to see the faces of those around her, and to note the small signs of genuine sorrow mingled with the ordinary relief that attends any natural passing at great age. Outside, the mist had lifted completely. The sky was high and clear, the air carrying the faint, clean scent of turned earth and late-cut grass. The grave had been prepared in the northeast corner of the churchyard, beneath the spreading branches of an ancient yew, whose needles lay thick and dark on the ground. The sexton stood a little apart, cap in hand, waiting. The vicar's voice rose again, calm and unhurried, reciting the committal. Forasmuch as it hath pleased Almighty God, of his great mercy, to take unto himself the soul of our dear sister here departed, we therefore commit her body to the ground. Earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. A handful of soil was scattered, first by Harold, then by Mrs. Finch, and then by one or two others. No one wept aloud. There were no dramatic gestures, no sudden outpourings. Only the quiet acceptance that comes when death has arrived gently, at the end of a long and orderly life. Afterward, people lingered in small groups beneath the yew. Voices were low, words kind. Someone spoke of Eleanor's roses, how they had bloomed splendidly this year despite the wet spring. Another remembered her faithful attendance at matins every Sunday, rain or shine. A third mentioned the shortbread she used to bring to the church fete, always the same recipe, always perfect. Harold moved among them, thanking each person with the same grave courtesy. When he reached Miss Marple, he paused longer. "I posted the letter this morning," he said quietly, "to Margaret, with my own note attached. I told her everything. About the old disagreement, about Aunt Eleanor's decision to speak plainly at last, about the letter she never finished, and about the scream." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And how did you describe the scream?" "As her final act of care," Harold replied. "Not a cry of fear or pain, but a deliberate sound meant to protect the truth of her passing. I said she wanted no shadows cast on anyone, least of all on me. I think Margaret will understand. She always said Aunt Eleanor was the most fair-minded person she knew." "That is a good way to remember her," Miss Marple said. "Fair-minded and thorough." They stood a moment in silence, watching as the gravedigger began the slow work of filling in the earth. Each shovelful fell with a soft final sound. Harold spoke again, almost to himself. I shall keep the house as it is for a while. Perhaps sell it later, but not yet. There are things I should sort through. Her books, her letters, the garden records. She kept such meticulous notes. It feels right to go through them slowly. Miss Marple smiled faintly. She would approve of that. Slow and careful. They parted with a small nod. Harold walked toward the lich gate, where a taxi waited to take him to the station. He had a train to catch back to London that afternoon. Mrs. Finch remained a little longer, speaking softly to the vicar's wife, then turned homeward to Willowmere to begin the gentle task of closing the house for a season. Miss Marple did not hurry away. She walked slowly along the path between the graves, reading the familiar inscriptions, names she had known all her life, in dates that marked the quiet turning of village years. At the far end, near the low stone wall, she paused beside a small plot where wild violets grew among the grass. She bent, touched one purple bloom with a gloved finger, then straightened again. The churchyard emptied gradually. The vicar locked the vestry door. The sexton shouldered his spade and went home to his dinner. Soon there was only the soft rustle of leaves in the yew, the distant call of a rook, and the faint chime of the clock striking 12 from the tower above. Miss Marple walked home along the lane. The hedgerows were heavy with hips and haws now, red against the green. Blackberries hung dark and ripe. A few late butterflies drifted above the verge, red admirals mostly, their wings catching the light. She passed Mr. Phipps's cottage. He was in his front garden again, deadheading the last of the dahlias. He raised his hat as she went by. "Lovely service," he called. She'd have liked it quiet like that. Miss Marple agreed that yes, she would. At Dane Mead cottage, the front door stood ajar, as she had left it. Inside, the sitting room was warm from the sun that had poured through the French windows all morning. The lavender shawl lay across the back of her chair, needles still tucked into the last row she had knitted the night before. She took off her hat, hung her coat in the narrow hall, then returned to the chair and picked up the knitting. The wool slipped smoothly through her fingers. Stitch by stitch, the pattern grew. Simple garter, a little lace border beginning to emerge. Outside, a blackbird sang from the apple tree, liquid and untroubled. Somewhere down the lane, a gate clicked shut. A bicycle bell rang. Once, children's voices rose and fell as they ran home from school. Miss Marple thought, as she knitted, of the small chain of events now complete. A woman in her 90s, knowing her time was near, had looked back over a long life and found one small knot still untied. An old family wrong, a silence too long kept. She had chosen to speak of it, not in anger or accusation, but in quiet fairness. She had written the words carefully, meaning to send them on their way. Then, aware that her heart might fail without warning, she had arranged one final safeguard, a sound that would echo across the village, clear and startling, so that no one could later say her death had been silent and suspicious. A scream, yes, but not of terror. A scream of intention, a scream that said, "This is how it happened." Sudden, natural, complete. Ah, and it had worked. The village had heard, noted, accepted. Dr. Haydock had signed his certificate without hesitation. Harold had come, grieved, and begun the work of setting things right. Mrs. Finch would continue her small duties until the house was ready for new hands. Margaret in Toronto would read the letter and know that her great-aunt had cared enough to explain. Even at the end, the loose end had been tied. The pattern was finished. Miss Marple reached the end of the row, counted her stitches, and began the next. The shawl was nearly long enough now. Soon she would cast off, block it, and fold it away for the colder months. Or perhaps give it to someone who needed warmth. A new mother in the village, perhaps. Or one of the elderly ladies at the almshouses. The afternoon wore on gently. Tea was made, bread and butter eaten, and the kettle sang on the hob. Outside, the light began to slant golden across the garden, touching the last roses with fire. A breeze stirred the sweet peas, releasing their fragrance through the open windows. Miss Marple set her knitting aside for a moment and looked out. The lane was quiet now, the day folding itself toward evening. Somewhere a radio played softly, an old tune, half heard. A cat walked along the top of the wall, tail high, unconcerned. She thought, not for the first time, how satisfying it was when human affairs, however small, came right in the end. Not through drama or revelation or sudden justice, but through quiet observation, patient reasoning, and a little understanding of the heart. The scream no one had truly heard, not as it was meant, had at last been understood. And with that understanding came peace. For Harold, for Mrs. Finch, for the village, and for the woman who had planned it all so carefully. Miss Marple picked up her needles again. The lavender wool moved steadily. The evening deepened. The house settled around her, familiar and warm. Somewhere in the distance, the church clock struck 6, slow, measured, comforting. All was quiet now. All was as it should be. Sleep well, dear listener. The day is done, the story told. Good night.